Hey everyone, welcome to this new video. In this conversation, we're going to talk about testing swimmers for VO2. Okay, Andrew, let's jump right into this really interesting topic that I've been wanting to talk about with you for a while now. What do we know about VO2 for swimmers? Talk us through it.
Yeah, so there's two main pieces of this puzzle with swimmers that may be somewhat different in some ways from testing in other sports. First off, just a little caveat that we know that it's tough to test swimmers, right? Faces in the water, equipment that doesn't do well with water. So historically, the VO2 testing of swimmers has been really challenging. And maybe we'll get into some of the details of that in a little bit. But I think it's important to start this conversation with having two different aspects of oxygen consumption for swimmers. One is a VO2 max, which most people are aware of through through cycling and running, step tests, right? And different ways of attaining a VO2 max score. And it has been shown in elite swimmers that a VO2 max does correspond very well to middle distance swim results, 200 meters and 400 meters. Because most of the testing of VO2 max in swimmers has been done either in swim flumes or in tethered devices, or using estimations of VO2 max. Most of the testing has been done in time-limited areas in the pool. So not a lot of evidence for open water swimmers or ultra endurance swimmers, or even Ironman distance and half Ironman distance open water swims. So recognizing that most of the studies have been limited to elite swimmers or triathletes in the pool, we know that a higher VO2 max leads to better swim results. On the opposite side of that is the fact that what we really want is better efficiency in the water. And this is where the greatest gains in swimming have come for years, and is how do we reduce the amount of oxygen consumption at higher and higher speeds to allow for longer performance at a given intensity. So two totally different sides of the same testing argument. High VO2 max leads to better performance in middle distance swimming. Lower VO2 oxygen consumption at any given speed will provide the ability to swim longer with less impact on the body, and therefore higher sustainable speed.
So I guess we go back to specificity, and we have to think about what event we're going to be competing in, and then that might inform us as to what metric we want to be chasing or looking at specifically on our testing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a huge key. You do not need a huge VO2 max. If you're going to be an Ironman swimmer, what you want to be is the most efficient. You want to use the least amount of oxygen for the duration of your swim. It doesn't matter whether you're trying to swim up with the pros at 49, 46 minutes, or whether you're an age grouper who's trying to break an hour, or you're at the back of the packer who's swimming an hour and 20 or more for an Ironman distance. You want to use as little energy as possible, which it correlates to VO2, as you can, so you can save all of that energy for your bike and run splits.
Okay. Is that linked in any way to lactate? And if we think about, for example, lactate threshold 1, as it's usually used in the longer distance, both running and cycling, as a good, not necessarily highly correlated with performance, but it is linked to some extent with better results, especially on the longer events. So could we say that we want that to be as high as possible, just like we would like that for, a marathon runner or somebody who's doing ultra cycling?
Yeah, for the same reason that a VO2 max gives us a ceiling for how hard people can push, or how long they might be able to push at a higher intensity. The lactate thresholds are going to be similar to that, although I will admit that I don't know of a ton of research into how a lactate threshold corresponds to an Ironman distance or a half Ironman distance. I haven't seen a study, and I don't know if it's been done to actually pick out lactate thresholds in swimmers. And again, my challenge with lactate thresholds is historically they were based on numbers that don't make a whole lot of physiologic sense. So I would caveat that if you're going to use lactate with swimmers, that a better understanding of how lactate is dynamically changes in the water would be a good first start if we start getting into that discussion. I know you have some testing coming up with some swimmers and some triathletes, and it'll be fun to see what kind of numbers you pull out from your data to help support some of the ideas that we're talking about today.
Yeah, and I guess the advantage that we have now with the portable tools that we have access to is that we don't have to choose what tool we need to use, if we should use lactate or VO2 or muscle oximetry. And that's why I like to slap all three onto people when I'm testing. And with the VO2 Master, we have the ability to be poolside and to take measurements. We've seen Christian Blumenfeld use this technique more recently in some videos with all of Alexander Bu in his testing. So let's talk about testing for swimmers now. We want to test a swimmer.
Sure.
Let's say we want to test them for VO2, and what kind of protocol have you seen used in the literature so far if we want to get somebody's VO2? And let's say we have a VO2 Master and we can be on the side of the pool, and obviously we're not going to be able to see what's going on inside the water. People don't use your VO2 Master inside the pool. This is bad news for you and your device. But once they get their head out of the water and they're on the side of the pool and they've dried their face, then they can put the mask on and breathe into it, and we can get a glimpse as to what was going on in previous seconds. So how would you organize? Let's talk about a VO2 max test first, and then we'll talk maybe about a longer sub-maximal step test to look at some other values.
Yeah, so yeah, great points. So historically, the VO2 testing has been done either in a swim flume or with devices that were hooked up to snorkel devices, so that the measurement device was actually outside of the water, but the face could stay in the water, and the testing group would actually walk along with the swimmer beside the pool back and forth and try and keep some sort of consistency. So there has been some good evidence that actually doing a regression analysis, so actually testing the breathing and the oxygen consumption at rest. Mm-hmm. So during the rest between intervals, you can actually look at the data from that as a correlate to what was happening just before it in the water. So one of the ways of doing that is as a swimmer comes into the wall, to have them hold their breath until the mask is on, and then their first breath that comes out, to actually look at what the oxygen consumption of that last breath is. But more importantly, what happens in that first 30 seconds. And as you know, as part of your 414 protocols, what happens in the rest interval is fascinating and equally beneficial in the assessment part as to what was happening during the performance itself. Mm. So to correlate that to swimming, it would be doing, whether you're doing 100 meter, 200 meter, 300 meter, or 400 meter intervals, it's doing the swim at a prescribed pace. And we can talk a little bit about how to prescribe that pace and how to measure that pace. And then have the swimmer stop, collect as quickly as you can, start collecting oxygen consumption data, hold that for a set period of time, whether it's 20 seconds, 30 seconds, or a minute, and then have them start the next interval. Mm. If you're looking for VO2 max data, then the most standard way is to do it as a step test. So you have increasing intensities until you get to a perceived max or a measured maximum. But there is really good evidence that there are other ways of attaining max. So doing a super threshold, so going all out and trying to hold on as long as you can. Mm-hmm. And as soon as they can't hold on any longer, have them start breathing into a bag or into a mask. And all of those are valid both of those are valid ways of attaining a maximum if that's all you're interested in. Yeah. And as we've talked about before, there's a lot more interesting information that happens the whole way up through the step test beyond just the maximum. But then the question is, if you're coaching elite swimmers and you are developing a program to improve VO2 max, then the simplest and easiest way to do that would be a supra-maximal effort. So an all-out sprint effort that is going to last anywhere from 30 seconds to 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. And then as their performance starts to drop off, you have the mask ready for them and they start breathing into it. And you can actually look at what their oxygen consumption is at that highest level. That would be the easiest way, simple single breath test look at maximum consumption, and you'll collect data for that 30 seconds. And it'll rapidly drop because they're going to be, as they're resting, but you'll see that peak. And you can, with swimmers, because of the kind of training that they do, they can actually repeat that effort a few times in a single workout if you give them enough rest in between. It's not a comfortable thing, but they'll quite often race 4 to 6 events in a single day, all at maximum efforts. So to do a short all-out effort and repeat it to see for validity is actually fairly reasonable. So that's one way of doing it.
Yeah, what comes to mind when you say that is the Wingate 60, and I saw a paper recently that was talking about the 60-second all-out test as being a good estimation or a close approximation of VO2 peak. So I guess that, like you said, 1 to 1.5 minute all-out effort would get us close to a VO2 max that we might be attaining on a regular step test. But again, it's maybe a little bit hard to do a step test in the water. Besides doing, well, maybe the first 50, you do it at a 1 out of 10, and then you go up in RPE until you're done. That might be one way of doing it, but
yeah, and with good swimmers, again, experienced swimmers who've grown up in the water, pacing is not that much of a problem. So when we used to swim repetitive 100s, we'd do a set of 10 100s, and we would descend them 1 to 10. So every one would be 1 second or 2 seconds faster than the one before.
Right.
And with good swimmers, they're able to do that. So you can actually put them on a pace and say, I want you to swim a 2-minute 100. And this next 100, I want you to swim a 150. The next one, I want you to swim a 140. And you can drop their times by 10 seconds each time. And good swimmers can do that within a second or two. So the intensity is going to increase fairly linearly. And all you need is a stopwatch to see what time they swam. And so you can actually create a plot that is performance on the y-axis, VO2 on the x-axis. You can get a fairly good representative graph for oxygen consumption at different speeds. So again, in experienced swimmers, it's a step test is actually an easy thing to do. And whether you do it as a 100-meter interval, if they're more novice swimmers, you can do less steps. So you could just do an easy, a moderate, a hard, and an all out. You just do 4 steps. That the data you can pull from those 4 steps is enough to create a good understanding of what that athlete is like, and will give you really good indications of where they're struggling with different aspects of their physiology that's limiting their performance.
Okay, so now Now we have sorry, no, you had something to add.
I was just going to say, the more experience you can add more steps to the more experienced swimmers. So a swimmer who's used to swimming a 5,000-meter workout, doing repetitive 200s is no big deal. So they could do 10 200s or 8 200s, and with that same idea that they start slow, and each one is a little bit faster than the one before. And if you give them specific times, they're likely going to get quite close to that. And you do the VO2 testing between each interval for the exact same amount of time, whether you're collecting data for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, or a minute. And then as soon as that testing's done, they get back and they start swimming again. They don't even have to get out of the water. They just stop at the side of the pool, put the mask on them, collect the data for 20 seconds, let them go again. And the VO2 master has a unique feature that allows it basically to rest in the background without having to stimulate it, and it'll stay on and wait for the next interval. So we are creating some app improvements to allow for this kind of intermittent testing. It hasn't, but even in the current situation, you can still pull that data without having to restart the test.
Yeah, exactly. It can idle. I think there's a setting to have it idle for up to 15 minutes, or maybe you can even turn that off. I think that's how it works, right? And you could just leave it so it stays running, even if it's not on somebody's face and there's no air going through it.
Exactly right. Yeah, you turn off the auto shutdown thing, which is easy to do.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we talked about the VO2 max for people that are interested in those kind of numbers. Again, if that's something you want to improve with training and target, that's probably something you want to measure. And no matter what technique or method or protocol you use that we talked about, always use the same when you do a test, retest, try to replicate the conditions so you can actually compare the data, because if we change protocols, then we cannot compare the data in any sensible way afterwards. So now we talk about a longer step test. We talked about that efficiency component, that is maybe more interesting for longer distances, which will probably cover most people that are swimming. So now we're interested in sub-maximal values. So we might want to have slightly longer steps, and we might want to have a set time of break in between. So what might one of those protocols look like? And then, like I said before, we don't have to choose. We can use VO2, we can use lactate, we can use Moxie in the pool. So let's say we have all three of those measurement tools at our disposal. How can we best
heart rate?
Sorry, and heart rate, of course. That was that was the basic one, that the default one that I forgot to mention. So now we have all those four metrics. How should we organize a sub-maximal step test so that we can pull as much valuable data from it, and again compare some efficiency metrics across time for swimmers?
Yeah, so I'm going to add two more metrics to that. One is just the speed, so the pace, which is easy to do. Just use your stopwatch for 100 meters, or meters per second, depending on which group is reporting data. Most coaches and most athletes will understand pace per 100 meters as their go-to, but most of the data is being reported as meters per second, which is challenging for some people to get their heads around how fast people are actually going. Just as an example, I pulled off the world record 400 correlates to about 1.8 meters per second.
Yeah.
Whereas a fast Ironman pace is about 1.08 meters per second. So when you start talking about meters per second, it's challenging, but you need to have some idea of how fast the athlete is going. So just like on a bike ergometer or on a treadmill, we use that to correlate to what's actually happening physiologically. Yeah. And the other metric, there's a few other metrics that a lot of coaches don't use that they should, and that is a distance per stroke. So whether you do that as counting how many strokes they take per length and then dividing it by the length of the pool, whether you're in a 25 or 50 meter pool, or you're doing it open water and you have some distance that you prescribe and look at the actual stroke count. So that's the other variable, is a stroke rate. So there's stride length and cadence for running. Right. Yep. There is a stroke length and a cadence for swimming. And those two metrics on top of those other metrics that you talked about, the physiologic metrics, are key to looking at ways to improve. So if you've maximized someone's stroke length, but they have a very slow turnover, then there's a clear indication of what you can do to improve their performance. But what we haven't looked at, and what most coaches haven't had a chance to look at, is how that impacts oxygen consumption and heart rate and muscle oxygenation. So what happens when you take someone with a very good stroke length who can swim 13 or 14 strokes per length in a 25 meter pool, and what happens to their oxygen consumption when you speed that up? So if you ask them to go from 1 stroke per second to 1.2 to 1.3 strokes per second, how does that influence what happens to their heart rate? What happens to their oxygen consumption? So those are metrics worth adding. Now it takes a number of people to help collect that data, because unless you have a lot of experience on deck, it's really hard to collect all that data at the same time. But those are worthwhile metrics to measure during a step test, especially if you're doing lots of sub-maximal work. And remember that most swimmers will hold steady. They'll hold steady stroke rates and steady stroke counts at different speeds. So you only have to you don't have to count their strokes for the whole 200 or 100 meters. You just need it for one length. Yeah. And then you need their speed over the whole distance, and you can average the speed out.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So we talked about all the metrics we need to collect. What would be an ideal length of per step? Let's start with that. There's probably variability there depending on the level of the athlete, the event that one is competing in. So what would be a good bracket from your perspective? And like, what's a minimum distance you want someone to cover for a given interval? If we're collecting lactate, we're collecting VO2, we obviously want that to be above 2 minutes so that a quasi steady state can be reached between delivery and utilization. So I guess that would be my minimum in mind, would be probably 2 to 3 minutes. Would you be in line with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for a good swimmer, that's kind of that 200-meter range,
Okay.
right? So our world-class swimmers can hold close to 2 minutes repetitively at close to race pace. Your slower swimmers, so your newer athletes, are going to be almost half that speed.
Mm,
Sorry, half that. Yeah. They're going to be. It's going to take them close to 2 minutes to do 100 meters,
right.
especially if they're going easy. So really, it is now going to be athlete dependent. So for your newer athletes, 100-meter repeats may be enough time to get them steady state. You might have to push that to 150 meters if they've had some experience. Your experienced swimmers are going to be pushing 200-meter intervals, and then your ultra distance and your really good swimmers who are actually training for big distance, you can actually push them to 300 meters and 400 meters, knowing that it's going to take them 4 or 5 minutes at each step. And so you might not want to do 10 steps at 400 meters, but 5 steps at 400 meters is going to give you some really good data, and won't be too taxing on a swimmer who's used to swimming 4,000, 5,000 meter workouts. So I would say anywhere from 100 meters to 400-meter intervals, depending on the intensity that those swimmers are able to maintain, or the speed that they're able to maintain, aiming for that 2 to 3 minute intervals, knowing that if it's okay to go 4 or 5 minutes, so long as they're able to sustain steady efforts for 4 to 5 minutes. Right. And so, some athletes who are new to swimming, any time you get them to swim for 4 minutes, they will have a degradation in their stroke, just because they're just not good enough swimmers to hold for 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I would probably, after each step, we're probably working a mandatory 1 minute break so that we can have repeatability from one break to the next. And in that time, that gives us time to put the mask on, get some VO2 data in, get a lactate measurement probably as well. And then the athlete can go back into the next step. So you talked about number of steps. So what would you say is a good number of steps that we want to see on one of those? If we're not looking for maximal values, we're looking for a sub-maximal test to get some VO2, some efficiency data, maybe even a lactate inflection point. So maybe 6 to 9 steps would be a good way to go.
Yeah, that's long. So 6 to 9 is going to be tough for a lot of swimmers. I'm thinking back to when we were coaching age group swimmers and sort of provincial level or regional level swimmers.
Even if
8 to 9 steps is.
Even if we admit that 3 or 4 of those might be below threshold 1 and quite easy.
Yeah, it's shocking
okay.
how quickly when you get close to thresholds in swimming, their stroke falls apart. Things start to go bad quickly. And this may be, in some respect, one of the downsides of swim coaching over the years is swimmers are not very, in my opinion, are not very well trained aerobically. So most swimmers can't sustain even strong efforts for very long. They can sustain easy efforts, and they can repeat very hard efforts with rest, but they aren't very good at sustaining high efforts, race-paced efforts for much more than a few minutes. So I would err on the side of, especially when you're first doing these tests with athletes, not to scare them away. Aim for 4 to 6 steps,
okay.
and see how they do. Again, we tested here 2 of Canada's best young open water swimmers, and they were able to do 200 repeats, and they easily could do 8 or 9 steps. But their counterparts, who were equally as fast as them, but weren't as good open water swimmers because they couldn't sustain it, if they did 5 200s, they were absolutely shattered, and that was that was the end of a workout for them. So so I'd be careful doing anything more than 5 steps with anybody other than really elite swimmers. And I would make sure, as you said, the first intervals have to be very slow. And again, swimmers think they're getting tested, so they overestimate what they think they can do. So what they think is slow is actually very close to what there ends up being their end-up race pace, and you will see very minimal changes to their speed, despite fairly dramatic increases in intensity. And this is again a pattern that we see in novice or intermediate swimmers, is they put more and more effort in without much payoff in speed.
Yeah.
Whereas sub-max efforts in elite swimmers, there's a big difference between a sub-max speed and a max speed, and they're able to drift that. They have a much wider appreciation, very similar to an elite level runner. You can send out a 2:10 marathon runners, and they can jog very slow and they can run really fast. But you take a novice runner, their jogging speed is not much different than their racing speed.
Yeah, exactly. And that range is really variable. And I guess that gets us to in my mind, the critical point of any testing protocol is the calibration phase. Because if you calibrate your test properly, you get the right number of steps that you want, the proper data, and then you can actually work with it. With my 401 step test, I've been kind of honing in on my calibration method, and I know I'm going to get between 9 and 12 intervals from the person, usually on the bike. So obviously we're not in the water and we're not going to do as many, but I know that if I calibrate it properly, I'm going to get between 9 and 12 steps, and I'm going to get between 45 and 60 minutes of work. And I'm going to get all the data that I need to look at the whole intensity distribution. But in the beginning, that was the hardest thing, was to not start too high and then end at the right output, because obviously a 50 kilo female that is a novice CrossFitter, for example, might be maxing out at 120, 130 watts. But then you have some guys that will push close to 400 at the end of the similar protocol. So you have to be very mindful of how you organize those intensities. So for swimmers, where would you get a swimmer to start on the first step? Let's say on one side you have a novice swimmer, and then on the other side, you have an elite swimmer. How do you determine their slowest pace that they need to target for the first interval?
Yeah, so I would really do it by RPE. I would say you swim this first one as slow as you can, and you actually look at how they move their body through the water, and how they maintain their best efficiency of just moving forward, but really with as little effort as possible. You try and tell them to do it at a walking pace. So I want you to pretend that this feels like you can go forever without any break. You could just do this forever. So as easy as you can possibly make it to move up and down the pool. And again, if they're an elite swimmer and they're going very slow, they actually may not have to do the full 200 meters, right? If they could do 150 meters, you can make that step a little bit shorter distance, knowing that they're going to get much faster later on. Whereas, and similar to a novice swimmer, if they go very slow, they could do 50 or 75 meters and still get that 2 or 3 minutes. So that first step, absolutely tell them as slow as they can possibly go, and pre-educating them about what the test is meant to do. Is you want to see what happens to their physiology at low intensities. So this isn't a race. This isn't a challenge for you. This should be the easiest. So I want to see what you look like when you're hardly doing any work. The next step, slightly harder, but really, again, a moderate intensity that they can sustain. Nowhere so close to race pace.
Right. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 kind of RPE framework.
Exactly.
And that gives us 5 intervals. That's probably a good estimation. And
recognizing that the last one, if they're actually going 9 or 10 out of 10, if they're actually going to go really hard, they may actually not be able to go the full distance that you thought they were going to. Right. They may go so hard that they are done after 100. If they're doing 200 meter intervals, that fifth one might only be 150. And it doesn't matter, because they're showing you that they've reached their max. You want to collect that data. So you need to be ready to collect the data at whatever point that they say they're done. If they make the 200, they've paced themselves really well, but you actually don't know whether they actually have another level beyond that. And we actually quite often did that with our swimmers. So we would say, how are you doing? And they go, I'm done. Like, okay, great. And they go, I actually think I got one more. Like, okay, do a 6. And they would do that 6. So that the ability to sort of shift that expectation on the swimmer is good for them to direct that in that final one, that they may have thought they were going 9 out of 10. And then they realize, you know what, I'm just getting warmed up now. I have one more in me, or at least I have a 100 meter effort. And we would sometimes add, just do another 50 meters as hard as you can. And does it change their oxygen consumption? Are they able to use more oxygen, or are they just flailing now and they're actually not using any more oxygen? They just are working harder without the benefit.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then I guess you would plot that, whatever data you get on whether it's the lactate, whether it's the VO2, you would plot all that against the speeds. And then when they replicate the test, you might not get the exact same speeds, but if you plot it on the same graph, you will come out with a trend, and then you can compare those trends and maybe some gains in efficiency in terms of O2 consumptions at a sub-maximal pace for those swimmers.
And that's exactly what I would be looking at. I'd be looking at the overlap of the trends and seeing if what the training that you've done addresses the issue that you identified in the test. So if you identify that there's an efficiency problem and all you work on is stroke dynamics for the next 6 weeks, then you would hope that when you overlap it again at the same speeds, they're using less oxygen. And that would be a dramatic reflection that the coaching that you've chosen to do is actually working. And if all of the swim drills and all the technique you've done have not improved their oxygen consumption at the same speed, then clearly it's not making the effect that you want. And that's exactly how we would use this test, is to test, retest, and see if the changes that you expect are happening. The same thing, I've had tons of coaches when they're developing their workout say, oh, we're doing aerobic conditioning, or we're doing VO2 max work. I'm like, okay, so if that's true, then you should be able to measure a higher VO2 max at the end. So after this 6-week training block, we should be able to come back and test and show a higher VO2 max. I'm like, well, no, you can't change their VO2 max. I said, well, then what you're doing for testing or what you're doing for training isn't doing what you said it was going to do, right? So let's make sure that it's actually doing what you think, and you're not just torturing athletes for your own ego to help push athletes really hard and not actually get the benefit out of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So going back to the testing protocol, the framework, I like it when you said that you might have to adjust the distance of each step. So maybe we could have, as the person who's testing the athlete, we need to have a framework, like a time bracket that we want the person to hit per interval, and that might be 2.5 to 3.5 minutes, or 4, maybe even for the better trained athletes. And essentially we get them to stop when they're in the middle of that bracket somewhere, regardless of how much distance they've covered.
That's exactly it. And if you know the swimmers' paces roughly, their race paces, it's actually fairly easy to work that out, right? If they're an elite swimmer that swims a 2-minute 200 meters at race pace, then you know that if they're going to have to swim 200 meters, and they'll be able to do that repetitively in that 3 to 4 minute range, and that's perfect. You don't need to really change it. If you have a swimmer who takes them almost 2 minutes to do 100 meters, then when they're swimming even slower than their race pace, 75 meters might be enough. They go up to 100. When they actually go all out, they might be able to get 125 or 150 meters in. But you're totally right. Just understand, you have to do a little bit of mental math ahead of the test to have it close. And again, does it really matter if the interval is 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, or 3 minutes? Probably not that much of a difference, right? You don't want to be much shorter than 2 minutes. You don't want it to be longer than 4, but so long as it falls in there somewhere and they've been steady state and they haven't been changing the pace through that interval, then you're golden and everything's going to be okay. And this is, again, understanding what we're trying to collect is a physiologic response to a steady state effort. And that steady state effort below any kind of threshold, whether so long as you're not going race pace and you're in a controlled setting, that the values shouldn't change much after 2 minutes, and certainly not between 3 and 4 minutes. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah,
when you take that sample. That
makes sense. So all that we have left to do now is go out and apply those tests. So like you said, I should have one of those tests coming up with a triathlete. So I'll be sure to put that to the test and do the best that I can with the protocol, and then maybe I'll report back, and we should do a little commentary video on the data we collected and the analysis.
I'll give you one other small thing just to consider, and this has been shown, is that swimmers have higher VO2 maxes than non-swimmers when you test them swimming. So it's sport specific. So if you take a really good triathlete with a very high VO2 max on a bike, they may not hit the same VO2 max. They guarantee you they won't hit the same VO2 max in the water because they don't have the coordination or the training to allow oxygen consumption in a swimming motion. They have really good VO2 max cycling because that's what they spent their careers doing. And they spend the majority of their time. So they've adapted their body to use oxygen efficiently, and they can use a lot of oxygen cycling. Swimmers who have not spent a bunch of time cycling and running will have higher VO2 maxes swimming than they will cycling or running. And that's because they can't coordinate their limbs to cycle as much or to run as fast to be able to get oxygen consumption data. The same thing happens with heart rate, with maximum heart rates. And there was a great study done a few years ago that showed that the triathletes had higher max heart rates on the bike than they did swimming, whereas the swimmers had a higher max heart rate swimming than they did biking.
Again, which would make sense from a training standpoint, right? To spend more time developing their capacities in the specific motion of the sport, and so they can express a higher, maybe closer to their absolute potential in that modality.
Yeah, which is why it's important, as we're having this conversation, people say, why bother testing them in the water? Because it is sport specific, and you'll see dramatic differences between non-swimmer background triathletes and swimmer background triathletes. And these are, the Lucy Charles Barkleys who came out of a international swimming field into triathlon, is an incredible athlete. But the reason she destroys people in the water is because she has super efficiency in the water and a background that allows her to use a very high VO2 in the water for sustained periods of time. And then she's transitioned that into being a great cyclist and runner too.
Right. Well, Andrew, I think we've covered at least most of the information that people needed to go out and start test swimmers. So everybody who's watching, make sure you write down everything that we talked about today. Try to write down your protocol as best as you can. Prepare for every eventuality before you go and apply this. Do your best in collecting the data, and then make sure to drop a comment below the video if you've collected some VO2 data with swimmers with the VO2 Master. And again, we'll probably do a video down the line looking at some swimmers data and how we can interpret that, and maybe how we can use it to inform training down the line. Andrew, that's been a lot of fun, and I look forward to our next chat.
Thank you very much. That was great to see you again, Sean.